The 360 on Energy and Carbon, hosted by 360 Energy. On today's episode, we are joined by Henning Gloystein. Henning Gloystein is Eurasia Group's practice head for energy, climate, and natural resources, based in London. He covers geopolitical risk in energy and raw material supplies, the transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy, as well as green industrial trends. Now let's get into the episode with Henning. Welcome back, Dave and John.
Really great to be back.
It is a pleasure to be back, and another exciting podcast. We seem to have quite a European connection going on right now, so I'm looking forward to hear from our guest today.
Today we're joined again by Henning Gloystein, practice head, energy, climate, and resources at Eurasia Group. Welcome back, Henning.
Nice to be back. Thank you.
Henning, it's my pleasure to ask the first question, and it's so great to have you back, and it was great to actually see you at eWorld a few months back. I'm really excited about this because the amount of conversations that you've had across Europe and around the world, it should be very insightful for our listeners, especially when we're talking about Europe. So we're really going to be talking about Europe's electric transformation. Well, let me set the stage here. So Henning, Europe has positioned itself as a global leader in green transition. We in North America know that. John reminds us frequently of that happening because of Europe. From your perspective at Eurasia Group, how is the pace and scale of electrification across Europe today compared to your forecast from a few years ago? And I know things have changed. And are you seeing an exponential growth from what you predicted?
It has changed quite significantly indeed over the last couple of years. When we first talked, Europe was in an energy emergency, trying to cope with the sudden loss of most Russian natural gas pipeline imports. Now we've come out of that emergency. Things still aren't great. The economic situation isn't great. The energy security is still a little bit fragile. It's not an emergency anymore, but it is still fragile. But what has changed since then is because we've come out of such an emergency, it has forced every single government across Europe, whether you're in the European Union or just outside of it, to really look at what works and what doesn't. And that has taken out quite a lot of past dogma from a lot of governments and induced a fair amount of pragmatism. Then what's also happened since then, there have been European elections. So there's a new European Commission. That's changed the landscape a little bit. In the UK, there's been a new government that's come into power since then with Labour. In Germany, there has been as well. So some of the biggest nations in Europe have had new governments come into power, and that's changed things as well. Overall, the green transition or transformation, however you want to call it, is in place. A very good example is that in the UK, since we mentioned them, Keir Starmer is now Prime Minister. He's a Labour, so a progressive or centre-left politician. He took over from a Conservative government. In terms of actual energy and climate policy, very little has changed. On the margins, a few things have changed, but not very much. Similar in Germany, where there was a coalition led by the Social Democrats, so centre-left wing, and its biggest coalition partner with the Greens, so Greens, and they've lost power, and then you now have a conservative leadership with a junior part of the Social Democrats. Yes, there's been some changes on the margin, but overall, net zero is in place, the green transformation is in place. There's been changes in the nuance, but not in the overall direction of travel.
I want to comment as a North American. I think we've stated this in a few of our podcasts. What's impressive about Europeans, and maybe it has a lot to do with the energy supply, you have stuck through this energy transition. You are firm. I see in North America, we tend to waver, it's so impressive when I see how Europeans have stayed with this. And thank you for sharing.
It's interesting what Henning's saying about the change of government here. We are getting something quite interesting happening because we are having a Reform, which is a rather right-wing party that are gaining something of a voice. They are at local government level trying to roll back net zero commitments. One of the things that has happened to us is that net zero has become politicised. That could be an issue for the overall transition. But my question's about geopolitics, which follows on quite nicely with that. And Henning, you've written extensively about energy security and geopolitics. How is Europe's push towards electrification shaping its relationship with traditional energy suppliers, for example, Russia? And what new dependencies or vulnerabilities is this creating with countries like China that dominate the EV battery supply chain?
Yeah, that's a big one.
It is, isn't it?
I'll start with Russia and go to electrification, then have a look at China and the other aspects. Energy security is indeed a factor. And what you also said just now about the rise of populist parties and like Reform in the UK and AFD in Germany and Rassemblement National in France, it is a real threat. First things first, I think Europe has to show success in the energy transition in the next 2 years. It's really a bit of a make and break moment. If in 2 years we talk again and prices have come down and the green transition has advanced further, decarbonization, renewable storage, and all the solutions that we have, then I think it'll be popular and leaders will be able to say we did it. If they don't, political groups like Reform in the UK and AFD in Germany and many others will say it didn't work. We are in a really important time range now between now and 2027. Every politician in Europe in leadership has to show that they are thinking about cost control, security of supply, and decarbonization all at the same time. So prices have come down, but not just because of renewable expansions. Oil and gas prices have come down quite significantly in the last 2 years as well. They're still relatively high, but they've come down. We actually think they'll go down further. What we need to do now in Europe, because we're such an import-reliant region, we need to further decrease our dependency on fossil fuel imports, oil, natural gas, and coal. I mean, coal, we're kind of almost there, but gas is the big one in the electricity systems. And that means that we can't really resume Russian gas imports, even if there was a ceasefire or a peace deal. I mean, we could maybe resume a little bit, but we don't want to raise gas imports from Russia, because then you're risking another disruption and a price explosion. We also really don't want to raise imports from the United States. When we met at UWorld in February, that was 2 days before the infamous Munich Security Conference speech by J.D. Vance, which I attended, and really was a game changer. So you can't really rebuild that dependency. Norway is a lovely country and it's got a lot of gas, but it can't replace it all. So we need to think domestically, what do we do here? The only thing we can really do is expand domestic low carbon energy solutions, like building out wind and solar, maybe nuclear in some countries, but it also means building out transmission and storage systems. And that is important. It's crucial because if we do that, we will get prices down in the next 2 years, but it's going to cost a lot of money. And really complicated is it requires collaboration and compromise between all EU members. If you're going to spend a couple of billion euros on a power line or storage projects with your neighbors and interconnect, you will need to collaborate, you need to spend a lot of money, and it takes several years to come into power. And populists and nationalists are really bad at both of those because spending for long-term gain is contrary to populist policy making, and collaborating with your neighbors is not really on vogue with nationalist policymakers. So we see this problem not just in the UK, we see in the Nordics, in France, it's all over Europe. You need to convince the people and the finances that this will work. You have, coming to China, you have a lot of these technologies which are dominated by China or about to be dominated. We can't build all the solar panels in Europe that we need to successfully transform our power grids. So there's kind of a consensus that they can be Chinese now. We still want to build in Europe the offshore wind turbines and onshore wind turbines, at least largely, here, and that's why that's subsidized. And you can see where Europe wants to still dominate the manufacturing, or at least play a role here. Wherever there's subsidies to build these things in Europe, that's where there's an intention and ambition to keep that manufacturing here. There's no incentives on subsidies now to build solar panels in Europe at this stage. But of course, I mean, electric vehicles are the next one. We need to get gasoline from the roads and diesel, and that's where China dominates that sector. Europeans make nice electric vehicles, but we don't make enough, and they're very expensive. So I think we're going to probably have to live with the concept that some of the cheaper EVs in Europe will be Chinese, and just hope that they also invest in making them in Europe, which is a bit of inverse of history. We used to make cars in China for sale there, and now we're going to have to tolerate that the Chinese will make cars and batteries here for sale as well, and then hope that our political relationship with China remains functioning enough that that doesn't become an issue. There's many people who worry about it, but I think there's no other way. And I kind of hope that China has an interest in keeping global trade alive to an extent that they don't risk that relationship. But maybe I'm hoping more than thinking here.
Thank you. It's always difficult. Geopolitics, looking into the future. I was talking with somebody the other day and they were talking about looking at the grid going forward and what emission factors for electricity might be. And they were talking about all sorts of academic ways of determining it. The truth of the future, we just don't know, do we?
Yes, that's the problem about the future. There are a few things I think one can say with some confidence, and this is, I think, actually quite important. I'm glad you mentioned it. If you look at the past, you can learn a few things. And I studied history, so I would say that. I remember when I started working in the energy sector about 15 years ago, utilities were saying solar panels and wind turbines don't really work. They're expensive. It's not always sunny. It's not always windy. and they're too expensive. We know now they work really well. Then people were saying batteries don't work in transport because they're too expensive, they lack range, they burn, and big batteries don't work at all. Well, we now know that works. I think we will see the same thing in hydrogen electrolysis. I remember just 2-3 years ago, actually even now people say it doesn't work, it's very expensive, and they're very clunky devices, it doesn't work. Anything that you can scale and mass produce will become cheaper and better the more we build it. And this is coincidentally the problem with conventional nuclear powers, because they're not all the same. Every new nuclear power station is a unique beast, and that's why they can't scale it. But that might be the chance with small modular reactors. So maybe that'll work. But I do think we can have some faith in innovation and scaling of clean technologies. I keep coming back to this with clients. The biggest advantage of electrification is, first of all, so there's two actually. First of all, there's no loss of energy. That's good. And second of all, batteries don't require fuel. Or batteries or technology, electronic solutions, they don't require fuels. When the more we build them, the cheaper and better they get. Whereas anything that runs on oil, gas, or coal reacts exactly the opposite. They get more expensive the more we use that stuff. And so I think there's an inbuilt advantage of electrification. Europe sees this by necessity. The Chinese are really advanced in building out a sort of the electro state. And I think those two regions will show the world whether it'll work or not. I am cautiously optimistic.
And let's talk about infrastructure. And I wanted to go back to your point where you're suggesting that you've got perhaps 2 years to demonstrate to these other parties that it's cheaper. It seems like we're in a perfect storm here because you've got an aging electrical grid, which was built for a different era. What do you think are the biggest bottlenecks you're seeing in countries like Germany, the UK, as they try to accommodate these massive increases in electric vehicle charging, heat pumps, and renewable energy infrastructure?
Yeah, transmission, it's the grid. We have no shortage of capacity, and we'll have an abundance coming up. If you look at how much offshore wind, solar capacities, whether it's rooftop or parks, onshore wind is going to be built, it's going to be more than there is demand for. So the problem is you need infrastructure, storage and transmission so that we can store or send surplus electricity for use in times or regions where there's a deficit. You can see that all over Europe already, this exponential increase in the number of negative power prices that are happening. Whenever it's super windy and very sunny, actually this week is a good example. It's been quite sunny and quite windy across large parts of Europe. So this has far exceeded consumption. So prices go negative. And that is grid operators hate this because it can destabilize the grid. But for policymakers and investors, it is a beautiful signal where you need to invest into transmission and storage. Now, the headache is that it is a signal, but it needs to be translated into action. If we just continue the signal, then the signal turns into a red flag and saying, like, if you don't do something about this soon, there'll be grid collapses. This investment has to happen. And this sort of links back to, so we need to do this kind of in the next 2 years so that these volatile prices, negative prices when it's windy and sunny, and high prices when it's dark, the infamous Dunkelflaute in Germany, so the dark doldrums, we need to average that out. And that requires this transmission and storage capabilities. And that's a political effort amongst Europeans to resolve in the next 2 years, because otherwise systems will break, there'll be blackouts and prices won't come down and people will say the transition didn't work. Thank you very much. And the green transition fails.
So I want to follow up because we have experience in working with clients looking at building new plants. The issue is, as you conveyed, there's power available, but they can't get it to the plant. The discussions we're having with the transmission folks, they're talking 3 to 5 years before they can get that. Once they have approval, they get that in place. So I'm curious, you're saying 2 years, but maybe you're much faster getting transmission in place than we are in Canada or North America.
So the first message is we need to hurry up and accelerate. Yeah. If you look at the European Commission and then the new German government, in the UK as well and elsewhere across Europe, the governments have said we need to ease the regulatory landscape so that from the point of view, apply for a project and that you actually can start building it needs to accelerate. It really is important. And this is across all of Europe and maybe North America as well. But if you look at the permitting to lead times across Europe, they're terrible. So that's one thing that really needs to change. There's awareness, but between the awareness and actually changing the laws, Europe doesn't have a great track record, but at least there is that awareness now, hence my cautious optimism. The other aspect, though, is that a lot of the stuff that we need to be active in the next 2 years has already been, it's already under construction or it's been.
Okay, good.
So
that's good.
There is actually a large project pipeline of power cables, battery storage systems, and offshore wind parks already under construction or about to start. So I think we will see a lot of solutions becoming available in the next 2 years. And the stuff that is applying now, that'll take 5 years, projects underway now. Some of that was actually enabled during the crisis of 2022 and 3, when there was quite a lot of emergency laws being passed, saying like we'll approve this now, and anyone who doesn't like it can sue us, thank you very much, and we'll resolve this in the course of the next 10 years. There's a lot going on.
That's great news to hear.
I want to put a supplementary in here because I completely understand that we've got capacity. We're going to have capacity. We've got to get the electric power to the users. And do we not have a problem here? Because there's not just the regulatory issues about having a smart grid or a fit-for-purpose grid. Somebody's got to invest in it. It seems to me that there needs to be this partnership between businesses, utility companies, and the regulators with a sense of urgency. Is that a fair comment?
Yes, totally. This is actually where Europe becomes less Europe and more regional and fractured. There are areas and regions where you have a very powerful government. Just Germany is a big country in Europe. They have a AAA credit rating. Even the United States doesn't have that anymore. They're sitting there and they've dedicated 500 billion euros on infrastructure spending over the next 10 years. Yeah. Of that, they've committed at least a third to be clean infrastructure. So state government, AAA rated. Long-term investors say, okay, thank you very much. That's brilliant. So there's a lot of pension funds who are saying, let's do this. It'll give us a steady return. It'll be built and it's great. Germany won't default, at least not in the time horizon we're investing here. So that'll work. And, there's others, the Netherlands, the Nordics, they're very strong here. Italy looks fairly good on this as well, although its credit rating isn't as strong. Italy sits on roughly 200 billion euros worth of unspent money from Repower EU times during the energy crisis. That's a signal that the Italian government isn't very good at deploying money. They're under pressure to spend it from the European Commission because they say, well, if you don't want to spend it, we'll give it to someone else like Poland. I think they will do that because Italy has a strong energy sector, so it'll happen. But other regions in Europe don't have the credit power, the fiscal power, the regulatory institutions to deploy these huge fiscal guns and project infrastructure plans. So parts of Southeast Europe, unfortunately, I don't think look very good here. Poland, unfortunately, looks not very good at all because they rely almost, I think, 2/3 of their power generation is still lignite generated. They have a lot of potential in offshore wind and solar, but the regulatory environment just isn't right. This risks something bad happening over the next, 5 to 10 years, is that once again, sort of the usual suspects will start outperforming the poor areas because this does point to stronger development, sort of the North Sea basin, roughly, and parts of Western, Central, and Southern Europe, but the Southeast and the East kind of is at risk of being left behind here. And then long-term, that creates new divides. Now, there are European Commission efforts to resolve this. So a lot of the support money is being targeted at the areas that are a little bit underdeveloped. But in the end, local authorities have to deploy this sort of stuff. And that is underdeveloped in parts of it.
Yes, and I have heard an argument that some people are saying, we only need to improve electricity distribution because of the energy transition. I think with growing populations and the need for reliability, we still need to invest in the grid, even if we weren't looking for an energy transition. Yeah.
And as David said earlier, it's also we need grids that are modern. We can't just build old style cables. Smart grids need to be developed. All sorts of new solutions need to be developed here. And in this, some areas that are really wealthy in Europe are really bad. Germany, a very good example again. Germany has one of the lowest deployment rates of smart meters in households across all of Europe because their utility sector is so fractured, whereas Italy has a really good one. All countries have to do stuff, and we're going to have to invest a lot of money. So there's this concept that we're going to have to bring CapEx forward to bring OpEx down later.
Yes, very true. And that is politically uncomfortable for many people, isn't it?
Yes.
Yes. But I often think when we talk about these things, there's a silly part of me goes, we don't need to talk about politics when we're talking about energy and all that. Yes, we do.
Yeah, we do.
We can't avoid it. It's what makes it happen. Okay, I'd like to move us on now to industrial competitiveness. And it's suggested that European manufacturers are possibly facing a perfect storm. High energy costs, competition from Chinese subsidized electric vehicles, and a pressure to electrify their operations. So based on your analysis, which European industries are winning and which are losing in the transition, and how is that reshaping the European industrial landscape?
So I quite often get criticized that I'm too optimistic about Europe's industry here, but I'll give it a shot. There are winners and losers, and there's deep change ongoing. There's big problems. Heavy energy-intensive industries in Europe are struggling because even now, 3 years after the big crisis, power prices and natural gas prices are still pretty high. They're a headache. If you add that headache on top of the skilled labor shortage we have because of demographic change, the immigration into Europe does exist, but it doesn't produce high-end engineers at the moment. There's a gap there. The regulatory issues that we've already discussed, everything takes forever to approve and build. That altogether creates real problems. Then you look into the industries which are labor intensive and energy intensive and require strong environmental regulation. And then you have the red lights flashing really brightly. So that is chemical sector. You need highly skilled laborers who speak the local language, whether it's Italian, German, or Dutch. They really need to speak it. And English, of course, because it's an international trade language. And that's a problem. The environmental regulation in that sector is humongous in Europe. Any change takes forever, and any new investment takes forever. On top of that, you still have relatively high energy prices. Those are really struggling. So ammonia production in Europe has become really tricky. During the peak of the crisis in 2022 and 2023, the main export destination for European chemicals remained the United States. So there is something in the messaging that we've all seen that Europe is totally deindustrializing, that's totally uncompetitive, that's not quite right. Because if you weren't able to export competitively from Europe to the United States in 2023, you wouldn't. I think that has to do with the fact that Europe's energy-intensive industry isn't as uncompetitive as everyone, including themselves, thinks, because they are more energy efficient than most others. They sell most of their product within the European market. So, it doesn't really matter that your chemicals are a little bit more expensive than in the United States or maybe in China. There's been a lot of money spent to protect these industries. But all that said, if I were to invest into heavy industry or energy intensive industries, and I had a world map without tariffs, I would probably not put that in Europe at this stage. There is a problem. And that means Europe is losing out in terms of relative market size. Until quite recently, the European chemical sector was almost as big as the Chinese, and it's nowhere near as big anymore. So it's declined in relative size. The Middle East is becoming a major chemical player because they've decided to move up the value chain. So there is a relative decline there. In the auto sector, we mentioned EVs. There's a really strong headache now for European car makers, whether you're in France, Spain, Italy, Germany, it doesn't really matter. The Chinese market has flipped within just a couple of years from being the biggest consumer of European cars to the biggest competitor. The market in China is gone, or it's fast changing or disappearing. And in Europe, where I mentioned BYD are now more popular than Tesla because BYD is on a steep up and Tesla is on a steep down, but in Europe at least. So this is a problem, and this will appear in electrolysis, machinery making, in robotics, in AI. Europe isn't great anyway. So there are troubles here, but there are also growth sectors. So if you look at the European investment into, it's called Industry 4.0. So it's like tiny mechanics, or highly sophisticated mechanical institutes, optics. The semiconductor industry actually isn't too bad in Europe either. So there is growth. And I think with the right political incentives, we can address all of this. I think energy prices will come down because of the energy transition. I think the regulatory aspect will probably get a little bit better. And with all the public spending now on defense and infrastructure, there'll be a lot of money deployed, which will create growth by itself. So I'm not that negative, but I have to admit that the sort of the environment of the last 3 years hasn't been great. But I think we're sort of crawling out of the valley at the moment. And I actually think we're starting to see the first signs of this without trying to be too optimistic.
Thank you.
Henning, as you mentioned earlier, individual EU member states are moving at very different speeds. How is this policy fragmentation affecting investment flows and market development? And due to this, are we seeing a two-speed Europe emerge in the energy transition?
Yeah, I think we are seeing a two-speed world. There are areas of Europe that really aren't developing fast enough in order to keep up with the regions in terms of economics, in terms of energy transition, with the more powerful and high-performing ones. Despite the fact that, for instance, Germany hasn't been performing well economically over the last couple of years, they've got the substance, the know-how, and the fiscal ability to change, which I think we're about to see. So there is a speed or two-speed Europe appearing here. It risks problems. If you stay in the middle with Germany for a moment, they still rely heavily on coal-fired power generation. They have a CO2-intensive industry, but they have the means to address that. In fact, they even have the means to create growth out of that change by being one of the biggest wind turbine manufacturers. They build a lot of hydrogen-ready gas turbines. Their EV sector is now doing so. There's opportunity here. Whereas if you look at some other countries in Europe, the change that we need for the energy transition is not just a need, it is a political pain with very little opportunity. So Poland, again, is a good example. Its economy is actually doing really quite well. It's got capable industries, but the fact that they produce so much electricity from hard coal and lignite means that if they want to change that, they will have to make unemployed tens of thousands of workers. And at least for now, import lots of solutions from their big neighbor in Germany or from China. This is a real headache for them. But structural changes happen. Germany will have to learn to build electric vehicles. That the party is over of them building the best internal combustion engines. Yep, they did, but we don't need those anymore. At least not that many. Poland's electricity sector has to change and adapt. It's a hard world out there, and we just have to create new growth and be innovative. I do actually think Poland can do that. They've shown it in many areas. They're becoming a major defense player in Europe. They used to just get Russian and Soviet stuff. Then they bought American and German stuff. Now they're developing themselves. It's an industry, especially recently. It's become much more fashionable, and there's a lot of money involved to it. So I think there is opportunity there, but we're at risk of some regions of Europe falling behind others in the longer term. And I think Brussels needs to be acutely aware of this.
Well, Henning, thanks for another great episode. To end us off today, what is the biggest takeaway for our listeners?
I think what we started off with is to highlight that the next couple of years are really important. We need to show across Europe that coming from energy emergency 2 years ago, to laying the foundations for a positive story and a positive trajectory in future with the help of the green transition and decarbonization of industry is absolutely crucial. If we can't do that, then voters and investors will lose confidence and faith. Then it won't work. But I think we'll manage it. When we talk in 2027, I think everything will be a little bit better.
Henning, Dave, what's your biggest takeaway?
I am calling for Europe to enable and ensure they're successful in the next 2 years, because I think they're actually the flagship. Certainly China's proving out to be very successful. What I know in recent days, Canada is going to be in discussions working much more closely with Europe as we go forward. I think we're kind of following their way on this transition. I'm really hopeful that your success will demonstrate to the world and to the rest of North Americans, specifically Canadians, that it is doable and actually a good business case to fulfill. I'm really pulling for Europe to ensure you're successful in this.
Thanks for that, Dave. John, what's your biggest takeaway?
Mine's linked to the 2-year thing because I think that becomes really interesting. I know there are some large corporations that are working towards net zero 2050, and a lot of their thinking is based on long-term planning. They're changing their targets to be aspirations instead of being a target. They're using comments like, it depends on society moving for us to move that way. And I think Henning's 2-year thing actually brings in focus. And I think it's not just at country level. I think it's probably at corporation level. We've got to make the next 2 years show transition is essential, doable, and will lead to a better world.
The bottom line is, if we don't do it, there's no other choice.
Without prolonging our podcast, one of the things that I find interesting, and, we've been touching on the right-wing politicians, and I don't mind doing this a little bit, they have this dog whistle form of politics, which is, net zero is going to cost you today. It's not really going to help you. And never really putting into context what happens if we don't do something about what may happen. And it comes to that classic thing. I think it was Pascal or somebody who had the dilemma, is there a God and what should you do? And I think his solution was, if you think there's even the remotest possibility of God, perhaps believe in him and work towards it. I think, and there was somebody did a matrix a few years back about climate change. And one of the things was about making your bet. Well, if you make good investments based on the idea of climate change and it doesn't happen, you'll still have made a good investment. But if you don't do anything and it does happen, you're going to be in a catastrophe. So, yeah.
It's interesting because I believe we've had Henning on every single year since we've started this podcast. So thanks, Henning, for always being a reoccurring guest for us. But today's problem is not going to be tomorrow's problem. So it's funny because we're talking 2027. I'm intrigued to see what our conversation looks like even next year, because every year that we have Henning on, it's a new focus and we overcome these challenges. And similar to what you mentioned, we become experts in technologies that we think are impossible and expensive. So a lot can happen in a year, and we're looking forward to seeing what happens in Europe.
Can I just say before we go, what we ought to do is get the editor to take probably 10 key points out of this podcast in terms of looking forward. And then when we meet next year, actually see how they turned out.
We'll have to do that for sure. All right, Dave, John, Henning, thanks for another great episode.
Thanks so much, everyone. Thanks, Henning.
That's all for today's episode of the 360 on Energy and Carbon podcast. Thanks for listening. Make sure to check us out on our website at 360energy.net and follow us on LinkedIn at 360 Energy Inc. Tune in to our podcast on Apple Music, Spotify, Anchor, or other listening platforms by searching the 360 on Energy and Carbon. You can watch the video recording and subscribe on YouTube at 360 Energy Inc. Email us your feedback at podcast@360energy.net or comment on our LinkedIn posts. See you next week.